Hello, my name is David Brett. I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times, coming to you today from beautiful Comox, British Columbia on Vancouver Island, and specifically from what's known as Goose Spit Park, this beautiful land feature that juts out and really creates the harbor of Comox. And as well as the park, it's also the site of Canadian Forces Base Comox. You can see some of the buildings behind me where they have various things like sea cadets and other military training operations. This is an incredibly popular park. We're in a more secluded part of the park right now. Next, you can see Denman Island in the background. So, why are we here? We're here in part to talk about the recently announced agreement between the provincial government and the Comox First Nation, which was announced by the government in April of this year, something called the Comox Treaty Act. So here's the thing. This incredibly popular park and location of these multiple significant military infrastructure has been given effectively to the Comox First Nation under the treaty. Or have they? See, the treaty is not yet ratified. So there's processes that are in place, but we'll get into the details in a minute. But what I want to talk about today is how this Comox treaty really touches on many of the core issues that are kind of shaking the province of British Columbia these days in relation to Indigenous grievance and specifically land claims. Here's the problem, is that all of the negotiations and talk about this treaty are taking place against a backdrop of a general loss in trust of the public in the government's ability to handle the negotiations, trust in what the government is saying, trust in what First Nations are saying. And this also plays out against the backdrop of the residential school denialism, false claims and labeling, and the Kamloops graves issue. It's become increasingly evident that there is no grounds for the claim of 215 children in a mass grave. Has the Kamloops First Nation backed down on its 2021 claim that there were the remains of 215 children found in front of the Kamloops Indian Residential School? My answer to that is, in my opinion, yes. They have backed down, they have flinched, if you will. That seems to be even major media like the Globe and Mail are backing away and sort of apologizing for not asking the tough questions. So against this backdrop of claims of genocide, that Canada is a genocidal state akin to the Nazis, and there's all these comparisons to the Holocaust. So what happens is the details that are buried in and included in the treaty itself kind of get lost. So here's another thing I'm going to talk about a little bit, is how this Comox Treaty connects to the Cowichan decision, specifically in that there is another First Nation that is objecting strenuously to this agreement that the government has hatched with the Comox, claiming that, hey, wait a minute, we weren't consulted properly. This is an overlapping claim. So there's these key issues that are engaged here. Plus, I'm going to just talk about the treaty process a bit as well. So just to start with the last topic first, this Comox Treaty Act is not something new. The negotiations around this treaty started in 1994, if you can believe it. It's more than 30 years ago. So the question is, well, what is a quote-unquote modern treaty? These, that's an adjective that's used to describe these treaties. They're called modern treaties, as opposed to ancient treaties, I guess, or treaties that were done, 100 years ago or more. So the BC Treaty Commission was set up in the early 90s to tackle a lot of these treaties. And here's what I want to say about that process. It's been extremely slow. There's only like 3 First Nations that have actually got to the end of the process. The Tsawwassen First Nation has a concluded treaty. The Cowichan First Nation in Powell River have an actual treaty. But part of the problem is the treaty seems to be less of an end and more of a beginning. And this is one of the concerns around the treaty process, is that it's couched as a living agreement, something that's going to continue to evolve and change. Well, at the same time, the talking points of the EB government are that, well, these treaties will provide certainty. Well, how can you have certainty if they're changing and evolving?
Periodic renewal allows for the 3 governments, Comox, British Columbia, and Canada, to reopen parts of the treaty to renegotiate every 10 years. This includes a Comox II clause. This means that if there was a provision that was previously missed in the initial treaty, it can be added to the treaty during periodic renewal. Periodic renewal also allows changes to the treaty that may arise due to unforeseen circumstances, including changes to the environment. This allows for all treaties to evolve with the ever-changing world. This is why it's referred to as a living agreement.
It's an oxymoron. It's uncertain certainty. You can't have both. And something important about the treaty process is that, and this is included in the Comox Treaty document, is that it does not preclude the First Nation from engaging or bringing specific claims before the Specific Claims Tribunal, which is the, that's the $150 million or less cash. It's not a land claim as such. It's a claim for financial compensation for something. Well, they're not blocked from bringing a specific claim. The same thing happened with the treaty in Powell River with the Cowichan. They put it in place in 2016, sure enough. Then they were bringing forward a specific claim on top of that. So now they're pushing for, and then there's all these additional rights. And of course, in Powell River, we know that the First Nation wants the town to change its name. But in this case, the First Nation and the town are the same. It's spelt differently, but it's Comox. So, the other interesting thing about the treaty process is that when you read through these treaties, there's a lot of things that the First Nation has to agree to. They have to agree to democratic elections and have a governance process that is suitable to the sensibilities of a democratic society. So while it's somewhat ironic that the treaties really put the First Nations on a path to be like a democracy within a democracy and follow these democratic principles. But there's also other vagueness in the agreements about self-government and co-management, and I won't get into the weeds on all of that. But if you look at the Comox agreement, it includes a patchwork of just under 4,000 hectares of land all over the place. This is very prominently discrete part of it, which there's actually a reserve on Goose Spit already, but it's a very small one. So the whole thing's being handed over to the Comox, and it's you really have to read the fine print to figure out exactly how that's going to work. One of the implications is that the clauses in the agreement is that the Comox will be compelled to lease the lands to the military. So you can imagine, well, is the military paying leasing costs to anyone right now? How much is that going to engage the taxpayer in paying monies to the Comox? How much will they charge? It's not clear. But it is clear that there's a lot of details spelled out about the buildings. There's a huge amount of buildings here. They can't just mow the buildings down. The ownership and governance of those buildings will remain with the military. But they've got to pay to have them here. What will they pay? Nobody really knows. Will they keep the same policies in force for the people who are frequenting this beach? I mean, it's getting later in the day now, but huge numbers of people are out here and around the corner, swimming and enjoying the water, have their dogs in the park. It's just a stunningly beautiful place. So that's one of the vagaries of the treaty, which is a huge document. Issues that people have raised are the governance, policing. There's talk of this band of approximately 350 members having its own police force. Well, how is that going to work? But there's also kind of vague wording around, well, you can still have the other policing services, but you can work it in later. So you find as you read through the agreement, there's a lot of agreements to agree. We agree that in the future we will agree to do something. So it is not just like a bill of sale. Well, here's the land, or here's exactly how we're going to do it. There's a lot of gray areas and uncertain future considerations that may or may not come into place. So I think the public has a right to think, well, wait a minute. If this is what a treaty looks like, how is that going to get us out of the jam we're in about all the uncertainty around investment in the rest of the province? So does this set a precedent? But again, it gets back to the trust. Why would British Columbians trust the EB government right now? Because of the way in which they're interpreting DRIPA, the way they've managed the court cases in the past, the secretness, and this is another element here, is that this has been going on since 1994, but it seems the public doesn't really cotton to it until it's a done deal. Well, they may say, well, no, a lot of this has been already worked out. It's not a surprise. It shouldn't be a surprise. But people, just average people, cannot bend their minds to hundreds of pages of documents necessarily. So that when it hits them, they think, why didn't I know more about this before? So here's another, I think, fascinating aspect to this agreement that ties into the Cowichan case. And it's a case of contradictions. So the Wai Kai First Nation, primarily in Campbell River, have literally taken to the streets to protest this agreement, have threatened to shut down shipping through Johnstone Strait and shut down cruise ships and do all kinds of things to protest this agreement. They're fit to be tied. They're very angry, and this is the reason is that now it makes sense that here in Comox you've got parcels of land in the Comox Spit. Well, this is part of their traditional territory. It's very close to their main reserve here. And it also affects the town of Courtenay, where there's land's been set aside. Courtenay Comox has almost become a melded together set of communities. But there's a contentious piece of land been set aside, 132 kilometers drive north of here, much farther north than Campbell River, where the Wai First Nation is. So they're saying, wait a minute, you guys are down there, Comox, what are you doing grabbing our ground? So at issue is an area called Salmon River near Sayward. So I'll get into how that ties into the Cowichan case. So last year, the chief of the Campbell River folks tried to get an injunction against the voting on the treaty in Comox because he said that the consultation wasn't appropriate, and there's a big of a fight over this land called Salmon River. So back in 25, the Comox First Nation put out a press release, and this is one of the things they said. It's very telling. He says, Comox assertion of rights in Salmon River comes from centuries of Comox occupation of the area prior to the Lequiltok arrival in the 19th century. So what's being talked about here? We're talking about going back over 150 years to a time when there was, well, let's call it conquering, raiding, usurping, taking of lands. So in the history of the Coast Salish people, there is a history of northern First Nations people, Indigenous people, coming south to raid, take slaves, drive out Coast Salish people in wave after wave after wave of conquest. This is well known in the history of the area. And the contention is that the Lequiltok, which were from much farther north, kind of took the land at Salmon River from the Comox. And there was an abandonment of that area. And there was eventually a reserve for the Comox set up there. And there was some suggestion there was a merging of bands, and that this issue was solved long, long ago. And there was a famous episode where the Coast Salish people in the southern Coast Salish ended up sort of setting a trap for the folks from the north coming down raiding, and is sometimes called the Maple Bay Massacre. Maple Bay is on Vancouver Island, where they lured the canoes, the war canoes, under a false pretense, and then they sprung a trap, and there was a massacre. And that is believed to have ended a lot of the northern raiding hostility. Incidentally, when the colonial government was established in British Columbia, and the Hudson's Bay Company set up their forts, the military might of the British Empire was used as a shield against these raiding parties coming from the north. So, when it comes to raiding parties and people coming from far away to take lands from people who had been there before, that is exactly what happened in the Cowichan case. In the Cowichan case, the judge ruled that the Cowichan, you remember the Cowichan village, is on the Fraser River, and it was believed to be a summer fishing village. So this summer fishing village, the Cowichan, who are Vancouver Island people, would have to come clear across the Strait of Georgia, I imagine at great danger in their canoes, to take up the land on the Fraser River. Which, how did they keep that land? How were they able to maintain occupation, the judge ruled that they had a clear chain of occupation, and how they achieved that occupation was through war and an absolutely brutal regime of fear. They had a fearsome reputation, but take no prisoners, and were barbaric in their violence. So the judge says, well, that's just proof that they successfully kept the ground. So the folks up here in the Sayward with the Salmon River area, couldn't they similarly say, well, hold on, yeah, well, our peoples did take and conquer and occupy these lands by force of arms, if you will. So what? Look what happened with the Cowichan. They did the same thing, and they were awarded $1 billion chunk of ground in Richmond. So what is the province doing? Sort of stepping in and saying, no, that doesn't matter. Something tells me that this issue is not going to go away. This Chief Chris Roberts, I mean, he's using fighting words. He's talking about cruise ships going through past former Rebel Rock up Johnstone Strait. We're talking about blocking marine traffic.
You think about it, there is multiple cruise ships that go through that passage. There's only one way to go, and once you leave Vancouver or Victoria to come this way, I think it's really hard for them to turn around.
Resorting to civil disobedience to protest this thing. So that's kind of, those are the key issues that I wanted to raise. Is that, number one, it's the treaties are not, quote unquote, done deals, it would appear. Or are they? So the public is left scratching their heads with this living agreement, which is sort of an agreement to agree to things that might, maybe, probably, we don't know for sure. Some things are, written in stone, some things are negotiable, some things this, that, and the other. And it's a fairly small group of people. And you have these overlapping claims, and that's the other thing I wanted to touch on. There's pundits and commentators whose take on what's happening in British Columbia is that, well, BC never entered into treaties with all these First Nations. They kind of bumbled and stumbled and kicked the can down the road and, neglected to negotiate these treaties, and they somewhat, blew it by not negotiating treaties. Or they just were greedily gobbling up land and resources to rob First Nations of what was due to them. Is that really what happened? I don't think so. And I think there's a factor, a set of circumstances here that is not necessarily widely appreciated. British Columbia is very different. There's some 200 registered Indian bands in British Columbia. That's more individual bands than all of the prairie provinces of Canada. And many of them are very small. I mean, very small. The Comox, 700-800 members. I think when they voted on the treaty, they seemed to get like 1,300 or 1,400 people. But here you have 350. You have some tiny bands with maybe 50 or 100 members. Whereas the First Nations groups in the prairies have much larger membership by comparison. 1,300, 3,000, and many of the nations in Ontario are into the tens of thousands. So in BC, enormous proliferation of Indian bands, and many of the Indian bands are really just part and parcel of the same people group, and extreme remoteness and significant fluidity of inhabitation in different places at different times. British Columbia is a relatively new place in Canada. Everything is still evolving and getting shape here. I mean, it's not that long ago that the Europeans came here. And it was, many saw British Columbia as a waste of time. It's like, what can you do with all of this nothing? Well, a specific point of history in this particular place is just down the coast of Vancouver Island over here is Nanaimo, where they discovered something very valuable: coal. And then boom, suddenly everyone's interested in the Vancouver Island. And in fact, Comox, there's a town up in that direction called Cumberland, which was also a place where they discovered coal. So the coal industry just woke this place up. There's a place called Union Bay down the channel here, where they built a railroad to the seaside to handle the coal. It's an amazing history to this place, and there's a lot of history here in Comox, Courtenay, Cumberland, and people are very proud of their heritage here and what they've built in these communities. So there's also that clash that's happening. So that's an issue, I think, and it's epitomized by this Comox situation. You have overlapping claims. Same thing down with Cowichan. You have multiple First Nations saying, what, the court comes down and says, well, this is the way it is. And they're left thinking, well, we've been robbed again. Well, where's the fairness to the ones who are left out? Well, there'll be reassurance, don't worry. We'll negotiate something later, we'll get to it, we'll address your concerns. Well, what does that mean, paying them off? How are the concerns going to be addressed? Isn't it supposed to be about the land and not the money? And this is one of the things that eats away at the trust, is the messaging around this is often very duplicitous. Oh, it's not about the money, it's about the land, because we have a sacred connection to the land. Well, if it's not about that, why are there so much money involved? So, that's this story. The Comox Agreement, yet to be ratified, going through, has to be ratified by the federal government, and the timeline is maybe 2028. Well, what's going to happen between now and then? There's people not pleased with this agreement. Thinks it sets a bad precedent. What about the other First Nations? What about all these questions? And how much is the federal government going to have to pay the Comox to have these buildings? As the cadets, the training, over the hill behind me is the Comox Air Base, which has been here since the Second World War. So, a lot to figure out here. Incredible story about this agreement and this amazing place. So, until next time, thanks for watching. My name is David Brett. If you appreciate our journalism at the Westminster Times, I would ask that you just go to our website, newstimes.com, and sign up for our newsletter. And if you feel so inclined, you can, there's a button up in the right-hand corner that says support our work. We rely on you to support our work because we don't generate revenue any other way other than people who want to hear independent journalism, like the kind of detailed research and digging in and on location things that we do at the Westminster Times. So thanks again for watching.